Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Savala Nolan, presenting her new essay collection, Don't Let It Get You Down, Essays on Race, Gender, and the Body. She'll be in conversation with Melissa Murray. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new and expanded digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Every week, we're hosting a slew of virtual events, and our schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After this introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to purchase Savala's book. Your purchases and your financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past year, technical issues might arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Savala Nolan is a writer, speaker, and lawyer. She is the executive director of the Thelton E. Henderson Center for Social Justice at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. You may also be familiar with her work, which has been featured in Vogue, Time, NPR, Forbes, and Shape, among many others. Tonight, she'll be in conversation with Melissa Murray, a law professor at NYU. She's a legal analyst for MSNBC, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other publications. And she co-hosts the Strict Scrutiny podcast. We live in a world that loves to categorize and to define. Check this box if, ad infinitum. But one person can be many things, hold many contradictory ideas. In her debut essay collection, Savala Nolan explores the in-between, from race to class to body type. Writing in the San Francisco Chronicle, Jolyn Perkins Valdez says, in 12 probing essays, Savala Nolan explores her intersectionality of race, gender, and body awareness with an unflinching honesty that is both revelatory and unsettling. The essays are personal and confessional, but informed by an awareness of larger historical narratives rooted in American culture. At the heart of the book is Nolan's insistence that she must firmly stand in her truth and not be roped into needlessly debating it. And Chessie McMillan-Cottom raves in the New York Times, these essays show how the pieces of our lives do not need to fit neatly in a frame in order to make a portrait worthy of attention. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. Savala, podium is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you so much to everyone who's here tonight, and to the Harvard Bookstore, and to Melissa Murray, my former colleague, whom I look up to and I'm so thankful to be in conversation with tonight. So she and I will talk for a bit, and then we'll do Q&A, I guess. But before we get to that, I'm going to do a short reading from the book. Short to the tune of like 3 to 4 minutes. I know some of the magic of a reading is, maybe dissipates a little bit over Zoom, but we're going to go for it anyway. So the section of the book that I'm going to read is from the very first essay, which is called On Dating White Guys While Me. And before I read it, I'll just unpack a couple of things to give it a little more context since the reading is so brief. This essay is about my former, underline former, but very deep and persistent wish to be chosen by a certain type of white man as a romantic partner, because I believed that being chosen by a certain type of white guy would lift me out of, the pain and the injury of the otherness that I felt about myself. The other thing I'll say about this essay and the reading is that, of course, I talk a lot about the body in this piece, But I, in particular, talk about my feet, which is, kind of odd, but it's how the piece unfolded. And I do that because I've always been self-conscious about my feet, and they have always kind of struck me or functioned as like a tell of my otherness. I always have felt that I needed to conceal them because they revealed my blackness and the bigness of my body in a way that I used to be really uncomfortable with, especially in a romantic context. And that is a very personal thing, but I think it's not uncommon for people to have a part of their body that they are in the habit of hiding because they think that to show it or have it be seen would reveal something about themselves that they don't want to reveal. So hopefully you can kind of tap into it from that perspective. And now I will read. On dating white guys, well, me. Holt was a catch, and I thought maybe we were heading somewhere, but then I saw his feet, and they were beautiful, unlike mine. Dating requires intimacy, bare feet, side by side, maybe touching at the foot of a bed, in the sand, the grass. I did not want to place my feet next to his. His feet were smooth and well-shaped, as if carved from marble, with neat cuticles and nails filed symmetrically. When I saw them, I thought, they're like David's right foot. Years before, I'd sketched David's feet in charcoal, full of hope, the filtered light as gentle as a powder puff in the Florentine Museum, a hushed flow of tourists and art students around me. I wish I'd sketched the slaves and their pocked granite confines instead. But back then, in the spring of 2002, it was David who spoke to me. He was being cleaned with water and Q-tips by erudite Italians kneeling on scaffolding beside his pensive brow. That's how Holt's feet seemed to me, like things another person would carefully clean for him. There were many things about Holt that I liked. I liked how his biceps emerged from t-shirt sleeves. I liked how he stood next to me at that Christmas party on Benvenue Ave, brushed up and emitting a gently possessive warmth that made me giddy. I liked getting breakfast with him early in the morning at the coffee shop that served so-so coffee, and I liked how it looked to anyone walking by, me with him. I liked how he lingered when I drove him home that brisk autumn night, leaning back into the car, suggesting we get together soon to study. We were in law school. His big nosed face and impish smile illuminated by porch light. I liked that he was from New York, that he was smart, that his dad was an iffy presence in his life like mine, that his sneakers were always clean, that he drank gobs of whiskey and beer and never seemed drunk, that his East Coast self-possession shone brightly against the floppy California exuberance in which we lived. And I liked that he was white. I liked his whiteness in an uncomfortable, subterranean way. I'd long sensed that the most succinct, irrefutable way to move up in the world was to be loved by a prototypical white man, i.e., someone at the top. There's a cultural magic in their approval, a kind of magnetizing glitter that surrounds the approved of object. So I pursued them. I had relationships with men of color too, but a certain type of white guy had a particular hold on my psyche. I hoped in landing one to earn a medal, to sling it around my neck and prove that I wasn't too low on the ladder for blessings. Adjacent to them, accepted by them, I'd undo the injuries of not belonging I'd endured. I'd become the girl I'd ached and tried my whole childhood and adolescence to be. a version of that fairy-like Nordic blonde in a Timothée shampoo commercial, over whom I obsessed as a child, floating on my back in the bath and imagining my brown cotton candy hair was a white silk ribbon like hers. Holt had potential. He could be my world of oysters. We clicked. He seemed to see that I was bright, credentialed, special. He, with his jocular, confident whiteness, could slay my otherness, rescue me from the ogre of myself. I'd grieve, yes, but then I'd watch my life bloom, unfettered by bigness, by brownness. I really believed this until I saw his feet, which were so handsome, sophisticated even, compared to mine. That's what I got.
Okay, this is a remarkable book. Hello to the audience. It's nice to see everyone here. I see some familiar faces in the audience, or familiar names that I hope will be faces at some point. So welcome to everyone. My name is Melissa Murray, as Claire mentioned earlier. I'm a professor at NYU Law, and I have the good fortune of not only having been Savala's colleague, but also her teacher at one point and currently her friend. So it's a real treat to be here today to talk to you about this remarkable book collection, Don't Let It Get You Down, essays on race, gender, and the body. So Savala, let's get down to brass tacks. You are in a tradition now of essayists, right? And it's a tradition that is, I think, inextricably linked to the Black intellectual tradition. So was that a conscious choice to tell your story through a series of essays in the mode of Ta-Nehisi Coates, James Baldwin, and others, because you are now in this intellectual tradition?
Wow, I could just listen to you say that over and over again, Melissa. I realized that you know, in the New York Times review, Trustee Cottom said that I was writing in that tradition, and I'm so thankful and humbled for that comparison. And I am slowly metabolizing it and, you know, it's just incredibly humbling, like trying to accept that, you know, perhaps indeed I am writing in that lane as a newcomer, you know, as someone who still
as a
has.
woman, I mean, it is not necessarily a genre where Black women are essayists, although that is changing.
Yes, it's changing. And you know, Claudia Rankine, like I think of her as an essayist. I think of Margot Jefferson as an essayist, although, you know, she might not, but much of her work is so slim and concise and kind of silver bullet-y the way that essays are. So I welcome the comparison. All I can say is that, you know, it was a dream to write like some of my idols, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Margot Jefferson, the people that we've been talking about. And the essay form is what's intuitive to me. You know, maybe someday I will write a full-length nonfiction book, but there's something about the form of the essay, the concision of it, and the flexibility of it that just intuitively works for me. So I was aware that maybe someday I might, you know, consciously be moving into that space, but I can't say that I expected to be recognized in that way with this book. I mean, it's dreamy. It's a dream come true.
Well, you have been an essayist for some time, yet, like as Claire said, you've published essays in Vogue and in other outlets. Why put them all together? Like, there is an interesting coherence to the collection. And was that planned? Was it inadvertent? But there does seem to be a series of through lines that thread them all together in the manner of like a Jhumpa Lahiri. These are not sort of one-offs. They all make sense and they're coherent. Was that a plan?
That was definitely planned, and I'm glad to hear someone say that it's coherent. One of the funny things I learned writing this book is that, you know, writing a book is really different than just writing a bunch of one-off pieces, because they do have to cohere. There has to be a thesis. There has to be some way that the pieces talk to each other. You know, they can disagree with each other, they can fight with each other, but they have to talk to each other in the same language. So yeah, it was definitely intentional. I mean, I think the things that I write about in this book and before this book, you know, motherhood, being fat, being thin, dating, being a woman in the workplace. You know, I write about sex, I write about state violence, I write about these things that are deeply embodied, right? They're all foundational and they're all definitive in terms of how we live our lives, but even more than that, they're all things that happen in and to and on and through our bodies. So I was writing the pieces that would eventually form this collection without quite knowing that. And then in conversations with my editor, Dawn Davis, who, you know, I love her to bits, in conversations with her, it emerged that the body was really what was tying all of these pieces together. And once once we kind of hit that nail on the head, the pieces really started to sing and the whole collection got more focused. And I mean, it makes sense because I love writing about personal things and political things. And I love thinking about how history and the present moment bang against each other. And our bodies happen to be where the personal and the political and the historical and the present are in constant collision. You know, there's always sparks flying off that collision in our bodies because that's where we experience gender and race and class and all of these things. So it became very intentional once I really wrapped my head around the fact that my body was in all of these pieces and the bodies of other people, you know, that I'm interacting with in the pieces were the animating force behind what I wanted to say in the book.
So it strikes me that another place where the body is really pivotal is in law. And you are, of course, trained as a lawyer at the best law school on the West Coast.
With some of the best professors of all time.
I wasn't going to say it, but there you have it. There's a way in which law is also deeply preoccupied with the body and this idea of corporeality. And what's interesting about your book is legal cases focus on who has done what to a body, but your collection, the book, the collection of essays is about actually being disembodied, like your body not occupying a particular place. I mean, one of the through lines in the book is about placelessness, or more particularly playing at the interstices of other entities and other realities, like whether it's race or gender, but like being in between and not really having firm footing in either place. So it's interesting that you say it is about the body, because in some way your body is disembodied in this.
Yeah, the phrase that I use is dislocation, which I think is kind of a synonym for disembodied. You know, I described this book early on as like a kind of a map making or a cartography, you know, in which I was attempting to place my own body like in the map of the culture, in response to being dislocated by all of the polarities that are part of who I am, right? Being Black and white, being Mexican and not speaking Spanish, having moved in, you know, some of the most elite, wealthy circles in this country, you know, as like a nanny or as a student, but not being from wealth, you know, having deep, abject generational poverty in my family, you know, at the same time that I was moving in these really elite spaces. And then, of course, as a woman, having been fat and thin, basically since I was like 3 or 4 years old, you know, through my whole life, kind of back and forth, and seeing things about womanhood and how people think of the female body and value it and what they inscribe on it based on what it looks like, you know, and the sort of inescapability as a woman of your body being read constantly by the culture, but having mine read in different ways depending on my size. All of those things that are part of who I am, for better and worse. I don't know, there's a way that they can just sort of leave you feel like you're orbiting. Other people have like a firm place that they belong, and you're orbiting. I think a lot of people have parts of themselves that feel liminal, or they have ways that they feel like they belong, but they don't belong, or, you know, they wished it was like a cleaner fit. But I do think I have so many of those things that like I can't hide them. They are who I am. Whereas, you know, sometimes when people don't have an easy fit somewhere that they want to, they will try to kind of obscure it and cover it up. And so we don't get to see that as often. But I can't do that. It's just, it's too evident. It's, when you look at me, you can see that about me. And so, yeah, you know, selfishly, I hoped that in writing about, you know, my body and what I have lived and experienced in these liminal spaces, I could, I don't know, map a constellation, right? That would illuminate who I am and where I am and what I am in the culture. Personally, I was interested in that, but of course, you know, like anyone doing map making, you're hoping it's useful to other people too. You know, you don't want it to just be totally interior and personal. You want to be able to hand it to someone else and maybe they can find their way as well.
One of the things I noticed in the book is your parents come up quite a bit, although in very different ways. And your mother, who is your white parent, she sort of populates the book in sort of snatches, right? Like, you know, you hear about the diet that she puts you on when you're 3. You hear about the conversation that you all have about Richard Nixon's conversation with Ronald Reagan when it's released in 2016. And then your father, though, is so present in this book. In each essay, like there is sort of a thread where you're contemplating what it means to be the daughter of someone who is both Black and Mexican, someone who has been poor, incarcerated. Has one, and it seems almost like you're suggesting that your father's experience may have shaped your life more powerfully than your relationship with your mother, even though that's the parent with whom you resided and spent most of your childhood with.
I think they shaped me in different ways. I mean, you know, I lived in my mom's house. Like she put the food on the table, she drew the bath, she gave me Tylenol when I was sick. You know, you can't, that presence is so strong and so full of love, despite the sort of veering into dieting at a young age under her supervision and at her recommendation. You know, you can't, nothing can displace my mom. She's a single parent, she raised me. And so it's almost impossible to even articulate how she shaped me. You know, the dieting was a shaping that I wish that it hadn't happened, but it did happen. And so for those of you who haven't read the book, my mom, you know, she herself learned diet culture from her family and from the 50s and passed it on to me at a very young age. And I was a chubby kid, and out of concern, you know, she had me start dieting, often joining her diets. But as probably everyone here who's ever dieted knows, diets don't work. And, you know, in my case, that those early initial diets kind of led to, gosh, 3 or 4 decades of harm that I'm just starting to extricate myself from. So that's what I mean when I talk about the dieting, you know. But my dad, it's funny, Melissa, that you say he's so present in this book, because I don't think I realized that, but that's feedback I've gotten from other people. And I think, you know, he was not part of my daily life the way my mom was. But his story looms very large in me, partly because he's why I'm Black, and my Blackness is, you know, it's up there with being a woman as far as the things that are kind of the pillars of my identity. And I got that from him. So there's a way in which, you know, something that's at the core of my being, I can't connect it to my mom because that's not how the culture works, right? We're one drop based, and so I have that blood from my dad, and so I connected only to him. Another thing about my dad that I think, you know, possibly impacted me in ways I didn't understand as I was writing it is that my dad was big. He was 6'4" and like, I don't know, probably around 300 pounds most of his life. Not really fat, but just a big person. And I inherited how I look from him, not my light skin, but pretty much everything else about how I look is from my dad. I'm tall, I'm big boned. So even when I'm thin, I'm not small. My features are like his. And so there was a way that he explained my body to other people and to me, that was incredibly valuable and that I longed for and I cherished, even though I couldn't articulate it as a little kid. And my mom's side of the family, you know, I was kind of an oddity. Like I was bigger than all the other kids my age. I was taller, I was fat, I just didn't look like anybody. But when I was walking down the street with my dad, my body made sense. It was like, oh, this is why you look the way you do, because this is your dad and he looks the way he does, you know?
It's a
And
sense of place. He gives you a sense of place that
totally. He was kind of an antidote in terms of my body to the dislocation because he explained me physically to myself and to other people. And so I say that now and I'm like, of course he is super present in this book where I'm writing so much about the body.
So the relationship with your mother, I mean, it is beautifully rendered, and you are, I think, it's clear that you love her dearly and that she loves you. But it also, I think, makes clear how difficult it is to traverse the landscape of race and phenotype and body. I mean, like, your mother doesn't understand how to do your hair, right? And that becomes like a big thing for you. It's how you present yourself to the world as a child. And when you talk about the diet, she like, and I love the contrast between your aunt Renee later in the book, who embraces your body, like because you are like the women in her family, and it's so interesting. I think Black women associate diet culture with whiteness, and I think it makes sense. I mean, it is, I think, a big part of what it means to be this prototypical ideal of a white woman. And I think many Black women rebel against that. Like that's not what we want to be. We want to be something different. And you know, I just found it like the duality of the relationship between your mother, the sort of the tension between these two communities that you occupy simultaneously, and yet the incredible love that you feel even when you're not legible to her in a particular way.
Yeah, my relationship with my mom is very rich in that way. I think most people have a rich relationship with their mom, right? It's just almost by definition how it works. But you're right that there's a duality to my relationship with my mom. And, I can talk about race because it's a powerful example of it. On the one hand, my mom was the person who had the insight that I was Black in our culture, or a mixed Black person, however you want to think about it, but Black. And therefore, the only racial home that I could have entrance to was in Blackness, right? Mixed people are not white. They can't, culturally, they're not white. They might define themselves that way, of course, but culturally, they're not considered white. So they're not accepted into whiteness. So she understood that, because my dad didn't live with us and I wasn't around his Black family, she would have to be very purposeful about exposing me to Blackness, to other Black people, Black kids.
You join the chorus. You get your hair braided with the African braiders. I mean, she is incredibly purposeful and indeed resourceful about it. But then there are limits that you identify. Like there's some boundaries that she can't cross and some things that she can't access because of race.
Yes, I think that's right. The sort of flip side of the coin is there were times when her own racial blind spots or her white fragility, to use the term that I think most people are aware of now, blinded her, right? So I was in this strange position as a child of having to contend with her own racism internalized that we all have. I'm not singling out my mom, but I would have to contend with her own uncleaned up racial bias as a child without her help, right? Like she couldn't guide me through that because she couldn't see it, she wasn't aware of it. or it was too uncomfortable to look at, whatever the reasons are that we don't address our biases. Yeah, I write about that at length, and about, my own contemplation of that duality as I parent my little girl, who is mixed and Black and light skinned like her mama. And think about, how I give her a home racially, how I teach her that she's not white, she's Black, she's mixed, in a way that is really nourishing and strong for her, but also doesn't destroy her innocence, because teaching a child that they're not white, that they're Black, involves at some point, on some level, teaching them about their precarity because of that, and the ways that the world can harm them because of that. So yeah, that's an intense piece about my mom and my motherhood and my daughter.
So I just want to just be really clear. I'm like, your mother is sort of scattered throughout the book, but it, it is a love letter in many ways to the power of motherhood and her motherhood, and the way she raised you, and the sort of insight it takes for someone to recognize, like, I need to go outside of myself in order to really nourish my child, whatever the limitations are. So hats off to your mom. As someone who's raising Black children myself, yeah, I don't think there's anything more difficult. And it's one of the reasons why I really found your essay about the white doll so penetrating.
Mm.
Not just the fact of the white doll, but how it then connects to this idea of birthing, of the medical profession, and the way Black women experience the medical profession. And, I think as more and more Black women talk about this, like, you are part of this sorority in which most of us have, like, gone and given birth in conditions that could very nearly lead to death. Like, in my second pregnancy, I had symptoms that I think now, looking back, any doctor hearing me report them would be like, oh, that sounds like preeclampsia. We really need to talk to you. And nobody watched me. It was like, oh, your feet swell. It happens in pregnancy. When it's like, no, your feet aren't supposed to look like pillows. Like, this is different. And you had a similar kind of thing. You reported incredibly extreme symptoms, and no one took you seriously. And then it was a sort of life and death situation when you were about to deliver your daughter.
Yeah, that's the other part of that essay, White Doll, because one of the things I write about is having a racialized pregnancy, and the deep desire to be applauded and recognized and sort of treated like a warrior coming home from battle for having gotten through it. Yeah, I mean, I ended up giving birth in the cardiac ICU because I was diagnosed with a heart condition while I was in labor, and I spent a week in the cardiac ICU. And then I was back in the hospital a couple of months later for urgent surgery and spent a week in the hospital. And this is because, despite the fact that I had been telling all of my white doctors, midwives, OB-GYN, endocrinologist, chiropractor, about these very extreme symptoms that I was having, which were textbook symptoms for what I was diagnosed with. They just ignored me. I mean, they just literally ignored it. They didn't run tests. They didn't ask questions. They said, your body does strange things in pregnancy. And
But also, it
they,
seems like your
they
body
advised me to get a better bra.
it's not just that the body does strange things in pregnancy, but the Black laboring body is supposed to withstand some
Yeah.
of this, and which I think was sort of coming through in the essay, and related to the question of bigness. Like, they saw you as sturdy and indefatigable, and not one who was vulnerable to these sorts of things. And yet here you were, literally on the precipice of a life or death condition while you were delivering your daughter.
Yeah, that sturdiness is troubling for sure. The presumption of sturdiness, and who merits protection, who deserves caretaking, and who doesn't. That's so racialized. And I often think that my fatness and my Blackness potentiate each other, because they're sort of regarded with the same types of disdain from, like, mainstream culture. And so being also a fat woman in labor, you know, I think it was just, I wasn't delicate, you know, I wasn't feminine, you know, it goes to that sense of sturdiness that I sometimes worry that people see me with, despite the fact that of course I'm as tender and delicate as any other human being. Yeah, and it, you know, it goes way back, right? Like I don't want to overdraw the connections, but you know, there's like a 500-year history in this culture of regulating and disrupting Black reproductive rights and interfering in Black motherhood in ways that are cruel and dismissive. And you know, again, I'm not saying that what I experienced is directly related to chattel slavery, which is what I'm talking about, but I am saying, you know, I don't know, I'm not sure that it's totally unrelated, let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that. And again, the idea that like you're sort of both vulnerable and invulnerable. I remember after delivering my second child, like where I really was very, very sick afterwards. I was
Mm.
placed on this committee at the law school where we both work. That is like the most onerous committee that a faculty member can be on. And I remember being like, I'm too sick to do this. And the chair of the committee saying, you know, don't worry, you can just call in. I'm like, well, I'm going to be breastfeeding. They're like, that's okay. And I'm like, no, like, you don't understand. I'm not going to have a top on. Like, I
Yeah.
just, like, I'm not going to do this. But some sense like you're always pitching in. You can pitch in here too, and that I think is sort of particular about Black women and maybe women of color more generally, but Black women specifically. This idea that whatever the indignity, whatever the mountain to surmount, you are capable of surmounting it. And in that essay, you were sort of like, actually, I'm putting my burden down so that I can deliver this child and then recover, and so I can mother her.
Yeah.
And it just sort of goes unwitnessed by the medical community.
Yeah, and I think I also needed, you know, I needed to say that to my family and my friends in a certain way. With that essay, I needed especially the white people in my life, and you know, that includes my husband who's white, to understand that I made and delivered my child under extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
And I have a right to own that and to be recognized for it.
We should have the Black woman's baby shower where it's like after the birth and you just like tell stories about how your doctors didn't listen to you and then you get a big
Yeah.
hug.
Yes, I love it.
Um, Another story that I loved here was the tale of your life in Italy as a student at NYU. So, like, I assume you went to La Pietra, which is NYU's
Yeah.
villa in Florence, as one does. Um, the way you render Italy, it's like a Fellini film. It's lush and
Oh my
beautiful,
God, stop it.
but it's also ephemeral. And I think at some point you realize it's ephemeral too, and that
Yeah.
the Italian idyll that you have been experiencing is utterly inconsistent with your racial identity, and it all comes crashing down in fabulous form. So tell us about this.
Well, thank you for the complimentary comparison with Fellini. Yeah, that piece was so fun to write because I loved Italy, and it's such a sensual, sensory, you know, it's a feast when you're in Italy. Everyone knows that who's ever been there or who's wanted to go there. And so it was so much fun to get to write about it and try to paint that picture for people. And, you know, I had this little like racial education while I was there that I'm glad I had ultimately. When I first arrived in Italy, you know, and let's see, was I 20 or 21? You know, I was pretty young. And I just gobbled it up. You know, I was just totally besotted and I just wanted to merge with Italy and be Italian. And I loved that the Italian people that I met had this concept of Blackness that I had never encountered in the United States. Their concept was purely celebratory. It was like, you know, Black Italian people would ask me, you know, what are you like ethnically? And I would answer, and as soon as I would say Black, they would be like, "Oh, Motown! I love Black people." You know, they had this like truly celebratory sense of Blackness. There was no shadow, right? Which in the United States, like we celebrate Blackness and we talk about Black joy, we should do it more, but there's a shadow that's inescapable and it's like at the back of everyone's mind. And you know, I don't think I have to articulate what that shadow is, right? We all know here in this space. But it was quite remarkable at first to just feel like the sunshine of Blackness coming from these Italians. um I loved it. But over time, you know, as you say, it started to crumble because I came to realize that like there's plenty of anti-Black racism in Italy. What's not there, or what wasn't there in the circle I was traveling in, you know, at that time, was like any vocabulary to understand that that racism A existed, and B like had roots, right? Like there was no real consciousness about anti-Black racism being present in Italy. They didn't understand that there was a shadow side, you know, to their yay Motown stuff. Um, and because they had no vocabulary or sort of interest in understanding the shadow side that is part of Blackness in an anti-Black world, there was no way for me to be fully Black. Like if I wanted to be Black in Italy, it was just sunshine. There was no room for me to talk about or feel or be in community around some of the things that are hard, uniquely hard about being Black in a white space, which Italy is fundamentally a white space. So yeah, that was so much fun while it lasted. And then it came crashing down because I realized, you know, partial history is not history. If I can only be a sliver of who I am as a Black person here, then it's kind of might feel like freedom initially, but ultimately it's like a form of annihilation because I can't be all of who I am in this space. So much love to Italy, but for me, racially, it was not the home that I initially thought it was going to be.
And it's the place where you recognize in becoming assimilated to Italy and learning the language, you actually lost some of your own heritage. Like you lost the ability to speak Spanish as well as you
Yes,
did before. You couldn't hold both languages in your head.
I did. I gave up the Spanish that I spoke, and that I have like a blood connection to through my dad's side of the family. Um, and I interrogate why I was so willing to do that, like so willing to toss Spanish out the window for Italian. And you know, the question that I ask myself is basically, is it my own racism? Like, was I just a little too eager to drop something that was brown, Spanish, Mexican Spanish, you know, not Spain Spanish, for something that was white, Italian, you know, which is the language of Italian. And, you know, probably that was part of it. I don't think I can separate how eager I was to do that from like the colonial racist education that I had, even if at that point in my life I was, you know, peeling the bricks away. I was peeling it off myself. It was still in there. So yeah, I did give up. I did give up Spanish for Italian.
I want to encourage the audience to drop your questions for Savala in the Q&A, and I will get to them. So please feel free to do that at your leisure. Uh, we've been experiencing, Savala, an incredible racial reckoning in this country, certainly over the last year with the killing of George Floyd and the protests that prompted. Um, there was another death in Minnesota that got a fair amount of attention when it happened, and that was Dante Wright, who was also killed by a police officer just outside of Minneapolis. And one of the things that really struck me about Dante Wright's case was one, how quickly it left the news cycle, and two, he was mixed race. And one of the most, I think, searing images of the aftermath of his killing was his white mother talking about her son and how her son had been taken away from her. How does mixed race heritage play into our understanding of this particular moment of reckoning. Is there a place for mixed race people here? Is there a place for Dante Wright's white mother to mourn and grieve and be well received by us as a society and a community in a way that we understand her?
I mean, my instinct is like probably not in the way that we understand. Like I think, you know, the way we think about race is a little more sophisticated than it was a couple of years ago, but I think it's still quite rudimentary given the complexity of race and the complexity of the ways in which we each are racialized. You know, it's like trying to talk about advanced theoretical physics or something in a language that you've taken like 3 classes in. Like, you know, your vocabulary and grammar are not up to the task. And I think that's maybe especially true when we're talking about mixed race people, and especially when we're talking about Black and white, because, you know, like we still culturally operate under the nonsensical 1-drop rule. And we don't know what to do with people who are Black and white. Like there's disagreement. There's no uniform agreement on what or how people who are mixed should be understood racially, right? So, I mean, I think mixed people in some ways, we complicate what we like to tell ourselves about race as a culture. But I'm not sure that our vocabulary as a culture has caught up to the complexity.
Which is surprising because if you really think about it, almost everyone is mixed race. I mean, if you take Caroline Randall Williams and her incredibly searing essay, "My Body is a Confederate Monument," seriously, we're all a little mixed up racially. Certainly, this country is. And who is coded white and who isn't really is just about how we denominate things as opposed to what is actually biological or phenotypical. Um, but one of the things that the essays in the collection make clear is that for you at least, there was no option of being white. Like you have this very complicated relationship to whiteness. It is at once available to you, but utterly inaccessible in the ways that it might be for other people. And you talk about that, like how, you know, your Black relatives talked about how you were yellow waisted, like light skin, but clearly Black features. There's no way to deny that aspect of it. How does the world sort of understand that kind of, and I'm not even sure if it's a duality, but sort of the amalgam of identity that you represent?
I don't know how the world understands it. I mean,
How do you experience it in the world? I mean,
you know, there's this great article by a scholar whose last name is Root, like a root vegetable. And it's called, I believe it's called The Bill of Rights for Racially Mixed People. And I would encourage anyone to Google it. Melissa, maybe you've seen it, I don't know. And you know, she basically calls BS on the ways that the world tries to police racially mixed people. And one of the things she says is that mixed people have a right to identify themselves however they want to, and differently in different situations, and differently than their family or friends may identify them. So, you know, I'm less concerned with what people make of me than what I make of myself, as kind of self-centered as that may sound. I mean, you're absolutely right that there may have been times when I was very young that I felt white, or, you know, that before I had any sense of racial categories being a thing. But as far back as I can remember, I have known that I was not white. And, you know, allow me to say that that is not a reason for grief or mourning. Like I do want to be very clear that I would not trade my Blackness or my mixedness for whiteness. And there's a whole essay that touches on that. But Yeah, at this point in my life, I'm less concerned with how the world understands me racially. I can't control it, and it's going to vary from person to person depending on what they've brought to the room.
So we have some questions from the audience. Elaine Leitner would
Oh,
like to
goody.
know how the essays, how did it feel to be so personal and intimate in your writing, and to present yourself to the world with such vulnerability? How do you feel about that now? How did you feel about it when you were writing?
Hi, Elaine. Thanks for that question. I feel proud of it now. This is kind of a memoir in essays. It's not essays in the more dry way that people sometimes think when they hear the word essay. Um, and so I knew from the outset, like if I'm going to talk about myself, I have to be vulnerable, or what's the point? I have to get as close to the bone as I can when I'm talking about these things, or like, who cares, right? Like, I can't ask people to spend time with this book if I am not um, being as honest and forthright as I can without like straying into being confessional. So yeah, I feel very proud of it, and I hope that it ends up being a something that helps people connect to the book, rather than, you know, feel like, oh, she's so specifically talking about herself that I can't possibly relate. I hope that in and being revealing in a certain way, that creates kind of a doorway where people can pass through, like, into this space with me. So I'm quite proud of it. As for whether or not I really had a choice, I don't think so. I mean, I wasn't happy with the pieces until they were where they are now. So for them to kind of pass my own sniff test, I had to get as close to the bone as I could.
What was the most surprising thing that came up for you as you were writing the book?
That came up for me. I think the piece about the role that state violence played in my dad's life, and in his death. He died a couple of years ago. Um, that surprised me. I hadn't quite put the pieces together. Like, of course, how if you have someone in your family who's Black and has been incarcerated, like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that state power has messed with them. Um, Over the course of their lifetime, but it did surprise me to unpack my suspicion that it also had something to do with how he died, even though he died of natural causes.
Mm.
So writing that piece contained a lot of it was eye-opening for me, and as his daughter. And the other thing I'll say, this may not be exactly what the person means, but I like talking about it. I was surprised by how collaborative the process of making a book is. Like, the writer has to get their butt in the chair and they do most of the work, but there are so many people who had a loving hand in bringing this book to the world. And, that was a really joyful surprise that there's a team of people behind every book.
Book midwives, I like that.
Oh, yeah.
And without all of the baggage of a racialized delivery, even better.
Right.
Where does the title come from? So the title is "Don't Let It Get You Down," which is something we say to people all of the time. But why is that the title of this collection?
So the title is something that an older Black person, my hairdresser, said to me. And this was like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I was getting my hair done, and I saw on my phone that the cops who shot and killed Tamir Rice, who was a little boy, also Black, were not going to be prosecuted. And, I'd been having like a nice kind of carefree day. And then I saw that news and I was visibly shaken. And my hairdresser noticed and he said, "What's going on?" He's known me for a long time. He could tell I was upset. And I told him they're not going to prosecute the cops that killed Tamir Rice. And, he kind of paused and took a minute. And then he said, "Don't let it get you down. Don't let it get you down." And he said it twice. He said it quite sternly. He said it like there was like a warning and like a heaviness, in the way he said it to me. It wasn't like, oh, don't let it get you down. You got this, girl. You know, it wasn't that at all. There was nothing peppy or bright about it. And I realized that in that moment, an older Black person was offering me a survival strategy, really, like, you know, high stakes, serious as hell survival strategy. Because if you're Black, or take your pick of marginalized groups that have been shut out, and you let it get you down, you let the reality of the violence and the trauma and the pain that's historical and ongoing get you down, you may never get up. Like, you may actually drown in it. So you have to find a way to stay afloat, right? Even when the water is incredibly choppy. And I mean it that way. I mean it like in kind of a heavy survival strategy kind of way. But there's another way that I almost could have put a question mark at the end of this sentence. Don't let it get you down. Because if I'm talking to white people or men, or, you know, the more privileged aspects of myself, it's kind of like, well, I don't know, maybe you should let it get you down. Like, maybe you actually should dwell in the horror a little bit and let it bring you to your knees, and then get up and get to work, you know. But your work is going to be so much harder if you've been brought to your knees by the truth of it all. Meaning you're going to work harder, not that your work will be harder to do, but that you'll have skin in the game, right? If you have felt it, if you have let it brought you down. So it's a complex phrase, and I mean it in a complex way.
It is a complex phrase for a complex book about the complication and complexity of identity. The book is called Don't Let It Get You Down, Essays on Race, Gender, and the Body by Savala Nolan. You can get it at all of your major booksellers, but please buy it from the Harvard Bookstore, and there is a link for you in the chat. Savala, as always, I am so wowed and amazed by you and everything that you've accomplished, and so proud to not only be your reader, but also your friend. So
thank you, Melissa. And everything you said to me, I can say to you. I'm so thankful to you and to Harvard and to everyone who came today. And boy, I could not be luckier. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you both for this amazing and heartfelt conversation. It was so interesting. And I know I'm sure everyone in the audience feels the same way I do. They were so happy to spend this time together. And thank you everyone out there for being with us tonight. You can learn more about and purchase the book at harvard.com or via the link in the chat, as Melissa mentioned. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night. Keep reading, and please be well, everyone. Thank you so much. Night.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.